Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Emmy Kim, and I teach artifacts conservation at Queen's. I'd like to first begin with the land acknowledgement. Queen's is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and Sue and I are both beaming in from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And now it's home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I'm grateful to be here as an uninvited guest. So this past academic year was a whirlwind, and it also marked the 50th anniversary of the Master of Art Conservation program. And so my colleagues, Rosaline Hill, Trish Smithen, Allison Murray, Erin Sugar, and I believe that the best way to really celebrate the program, better than a party or a giant cake, although that's not necessarily excluded, would be to foreground the real stars who were you, many illustrious MAC graduates around the world. And so today we have with us Sue Maltby. Sue graduated from Queen's in 1984 in the artifacts stream. And before arriving at Queen's, however, she obtained her undergraduate degree in anthropology and archaeology from the University of Toronto. And as an archaeologist, Sue has done fieldwork in Israel, Egypt, and Cyprus, and then worked in Jordan as a conservator archaeologist. She worked for CCI, the Canadian Conservation Institute, for 4 years. And then she began her private practice in late 1988. And many of you know of her firm, Maltby and Associates, which offers a variety of services, including, of course, treatment, training, surveys, advice on collections care management, and also guidelines for exhibits. And Sue is also adjunct professor in the Museum Studies program in the Faculty of Information at U of T. I wanted to highlight something that she contributed a chapter to, which is the 2024 volume, Collections Management as a Critical Museum Practice, which I'm going to put in the chat in a moment. And she contributed a chapter on public art and artifacts. And I like this chapter because it grapples with conservation ethics, things like artistic intent, purpose, as well as minimal intervention and reversibility, which are really salient in the context of art in the public realm. And today you'll hear about one and many case studies, but one case study in particular, which is Richard Serra's monumental tilted sphere sculpture, which I'm sure you'll seen at Pearson. So needless to say, this chapter is really worth a read. And then, of course, outside of work, I know that Sue is a canine enthusiast. You should ask her about Sophia, as well as being an avid birder, gardener, and reader of cookbooks. And Sue, thanks for presenting today. I'll let you.
So we're going to share?
I am. I'm doing it now.
It'll take a while here.
Can everyone see that in the chat? Just making sure.
Okay, are we good? Everyone can hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Should we get started? All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Emmy. Hang on, my advancer's not working. Sorry. I came to Queen's, as Emmy said, with a background in anthropology, archaeology, having done fieldwork in Egypt, Israel, and Cyprus. And given my background, it's not too surprising that I'd end up in the artifact stream. And this image was taken at Karnak in Upper Egypt. Sadly, the site that I worked on was not as interesting as this. For this talk, I put out the word to some of my classmates looking for photos of our time at Queen's. This is one of the few lab shots that I got. Most were party shots, which, I mean, we did have a good time, so I guess that's okay. And this photo was taken at the 1983 student conference in Cooperstown. I honestly remember very little about this conference other than a few of us were too poor to stay in the hotel where the conference was. Ian kindly brought along his tent trailer and we camped in a nearby campground. Our camping caused quite a buzz at the conference and we were the camping Canadians. Through the magic of Ron Irvin, our photo prof, this image was transformed into, doctored into include our missing colleagues. It's important to remember that this was done in the pre-Photoshop days. When I graduated from Queen's in 1984, there were very few conservation jobs. I was most fortunate to be hired by CCI initially as a mobile lab intern and then on a 2-year term. For those that are not familiar with it, the mobile lab program brought preventive conservation to small community museums across Canada. We drove around in the mobile lab, which you can see here. The lab was kitted out as a mini conservation lab on wheels. In my time out on the road, we never worked in it, using it only to store stuff. As an intern, I traveled with a senior conservator for 3 weeks at a time. We'd fly into an airport closest to our first stop, pick up the van, and then work through the planned visits, spending on average 2 days in each museum. We'd leave the van at another airport for the next team to pick up, and we'd fly back to Ottawa. Back in Ottawa, we would write up a report for each museum we visited, outlining our findings and recommendations. Essentially, we were producing a consultant's report, a lot like what I do now. We did 2 trips a summer. Prior to going out on the lab, we were given several days training in the labs at CCI. So we were in textiles, furniture, paper, ethnology. The skills that I learned during that training, things like making boxes and storage mounts for objects, are skills that I use to this day. And I still use some of the didactic materials we made in each lab in my teaching, and there's some of them there. One of the things we learned how to do was to make gummed paper tape mannequins, referred to many as gum-dums. This is one of the museums we visited on the mobile lab. It's in rural Saskatchewan, and that Quonset hut you see in the background is the museum. These little girls were so proud that they were the first gum-dums in town. In one afternoon, we were able to make exhibit mounts for 2 historic shirtwaists in the museum's collection. I love the mobile lab, and it cemented my commitment to preventive conservation. I also learned how to do a lot with very little money, which has put me in good stead as museums often have little money for preservation. When we interns were not on the road, we were assigned to a specific lab. I was in ethnology, where I dealt with First Nations and Inuit material primarily, but I also treated a pair of severely degraded rubber bathing suit, shoes, a NASA spacesuit, and Egyptian cartonnage. And interestingly enough, I was able to revisit her about a year ago when I was down at the Chatham-Kent Museum, which is where she lives, for a consultation. I also co-developed and delivered a seminar opening and closing a seasonal museum. While at CCI, I was asked by a friend to give a preservation workshop for the Canadian Numismatic Association at their annual convention in Charlottetown. I pitched this to my boss, Tom Stone. I have to admit it was a rather soft pitch, as Tom was a numismatist. Tom approved the workshop and gave me the time and resources to do the research and testing for my presentation. While at the convention, the editor of Coin World, a US weekly publication, approached me and asked if I'd like to become a monthly columnist for them writing about numismatic preservation. I said, sure, why not? Originally, my column was entitled Saving Money, and every pun was intended, but at some point, some bright light decided to change it to Preserving Collectibles. Here we go. My column is always focused on preventive care. I discuss topics that they, as collectors, may have to deal with. A few years ago, my column went from being monthly to being quarterly, which was totally fine by me. As having written it for over 30 years, there are times when coming up with a topic can be difficult to do. After 2 years, the mobile lab program ended, and I was fortunate to be offered a 2-year term position, filling in for my ethnology lab mate, Janet Mason, who took leave to work in Hawaii. I knew that once my term was up, I'd be out of a job. So my husband and I made a deal. Whoever got the first real job would be where we'd end up. He got the real job in Toronto, so that was where we settled. And due to the lack of jobs there for me, I set up in private practice in the fall of 1988. I considered it a real privilege to have spent almost 4 years at CCI. There I was able to work with conservators and conservation scientists and take the time to develop complex treatments that one rarely has time and support to do anywhere else. My time at CCI was foundational to my practice. When I left school, unlike several of my classmates, my plan was not to set up in private practice. I was going to get a job and I was going to work in a museum. Well, that didn't happen. I honestly didn't know if private practice would suit me until I did it. I found that I was able to go to work when there was no work. To me, private practice is like being perpetually unemployed. Initially, I worked from home, which made it easier to weather the times when you don't get paid promptly, which sadly is an ongoing issue. The only overhead I can avoid paying is my salary. Everything else I have to pay. Private practice can be very solitary. I went from being a CCI, where there were lots of conservators and conservation scientists to bounce ideas off, I could get analysis done if I needed it, to just me and the dog. So early on, I developed a network of folks that I would call on for help, some of whom are on this call today. They generously shared their knowledge and expertise, for which I'm quite grateful. Over the years, I managed to fall into things that I never thought I'd deal with when I left school, and I've never been allowed to fall out of them. In the spring and summer of 1989, I worked here at the historic Church of the Holy Trinity in downtown Toronto, and that's the church that's behind the Eaton Centre. This was the first big project I worked on after coming back to Toronto. I worked as part of a team of conservators that included my friend and classmate, Greg Howarth. We conserved and restored the original stencil decoration, which you see here. Work included consolidation of extant stencil decoration, removal of overpaint, and filling in the missing bits. Here we see a section that Greg worked on before and after. Greg worked on the bigger areas and I on the smaller ones. We used Mylar stencils to replicate the missing decoration. If you look closely at this image, you can see the stencil taped to the wall. Basically, look at my head and go forward. I essentially in-stenciled and in-gilded for the entire summer. And here's an after shot. This is a stock from the church, but I went back to look at it a couple of weeks ago and it still looks really, really good. This was a very challenging project in so many ways. The one thing I learned from it is I really like big projects and I like site work. And I also realized that working at 20 to 30 feet in the air did make me reconsider the old 6-inch, 6-foot rule. This is another early project of mine. You're looking at an archival image of the historic Bank of Montreal in downtown Toronto, which was restored and converted to house the Hockey Hall of Fame. I worked on the galvanized sheet metal cupola on the roof. I was hired because the restoration architect had specified that a conservator oversee the work done on the cupola. This is the first project where I experienced an architect specification, and it was a bit of a steep learning curve. A spec is essentially a treatment proposal outlining the work that is to be done and by whom. Unlike our treatment proposals, they tend to be really long and your work can hide in all kinds of places. My work had to abide by the architect's spec. I was responsible for condition reporting the cupola, cleaning it, and applying a rust converter to the corroded metal. The architect had read about CCI's research into rust converters and specified their use. I got to choose which converter I used. I chose Conquest as it had done very well in the tests. Oh, shoot. Sorry about that, folks. I worked with the sheet metal workers from Heather and Little, a firm that specializes in historic sheet metal. These guys have a dual trade, roofing and sheet metal, and they are extremely skilled. I worked with Heather and Little. I've worked with them on and off over the years. The architect thought I was going to babysit these guys, and I didn't. We actually worked together. So they did the repairs, and then after that was done, it was painted. I have worked on, in, and around this building, Queen's Park, for over 30 years. Here I fell into working on buildings. As far as I'm concerned, buildings are just big objects in an uncontrolled environment. I'm currently working there with restoration architect Michael Scott. That's the person on the left, and he's the other Michael Scott. We are in year 4 of a 5-year contract dealing with the maintenance of all the exterior historic metalwork, which includes lights, railings, bronze sculptures, and plaques. Once a year, we review the condition of all the metalwork and specify the work to be done that season. Although I do treatments, I'm often in the role as at Queen's Park to specify and oversee a treatment rather than do it myself. It really depends on whose side of the table I'm on, either the client or the contractor. If I'm on the client side, I'll do the assessment, develop a treatment that will be then implemented by a contractor, often another conservator. It all depends on the project and the skills needed. At Queen's Park, I met the gentleman you see on the right. That's my very dear friend and mentor, Per Newmeyer. Per was a stone carver by trade and a stone conservator. We worked together for a number of years. Essentially, what I know about stone, I learned from him. I was essentially his apprentice. Overseeing the move of large, complex objects is also something I fell into doing. The Library of Parliament was another of my projects. I was hired to work with a contractor who was responsible for the conservation of all the historic metalwork inside and on the exterior of the building. The metalwork was removed from the site and brought to the contractor's shop here in Toronto. It was my job to condition report all of the components, write a treatment proposal for each component in keeping with the restorations architect's specification, oversee the conservation, and provide treatment reports and marked up as built drawings. All of the work, with the exception of these bronze balusters from the west stair, was done by the skilled trades. We treated these. And when I say we, I mean me and Brett Davis, Age of Bronze. Brett is a sculptor, foundryman, and master patinator. We have worked together on bronze projects for 25 years, and it's a really good partnership. I look at a bronze sculpture as a conservator, and he looks at it from the standpoint of how it was fabricated and finished. And here you can see the baluster before and after treatment and after installation. The balusters were supposed to be maintained on a regular basis, but I honestly don't know if that was done because I haven't seen them for ages. And you can, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this building, but it's absolutely beautiful outside and in. And I can tell you from personal experience, there's one heck of a lot of metal in and on that building. I work a lot in multidisciplinary teams. Who is on the team really depends on the project. In the case of this project, I worked with a restoration architect and a structural engineer. With other projects, the team may include a landscape architect, interpretive planner, architect, exhibit designer, whoever is there to get the job done. I love the synergy that comes from sitting around the table with folks who do not see the issues at hand the way I do. It has been my experience that for most projects, the conservator is not the lead, and I'm just fine with that. You don't always get every project you bid on, and you can put a lot of work into responding for a request for proposal. If you get the job, that's great. But if you don't, that time is gone and you'll never get it back. My company is called And Associates for a reason. I am my company's only employee, but I have a handful of valued associates who I work with on a case-by-case basis, depending on the project. These are people I've worked with for years and essentially share a brain with. Teaching and training have been an important part of my practice. I have taught in the Museum Studies program, as Emmy said, at the University of Toronto for over 30 years. My course deals with preventive conservation. Most of my students will end up in an institution without a conservator and will be the frontline person responsible for the care of the collections. The Museum Studies program is very similar to ours in that it's a professional program. One of the things that I love about teaching graduate students is that in a short period of time, they become my colleagues. Down the road, it's so nice to see them all grown up as museum professionals. I find it really quite gratifying. As Emmy mentioned, through my connection to museum studies, I was asked to contribute a chapter to this collections management textbook, which should be in the chat, by one of the editors, Kara, who's a colleague of mine in the program. My chapter is entitled Public Art and Artifacts, Who Cares? Caring for Art and Artifacts in the Public Realm, Ethical Considerations. I discussed this topic with the help of 3 case studies, exploring the many challenges I have faced when caring for public art and artifacts. Although I write a lot in my practice, I've never written a chapter for a book, and something that could be potentially read by a lot of people, and I found that quite daunting. I teach a distance version of my U of T course for UVic's Cultural Resource Management program. I was also a sabbatical replacement at Queen's in the fall of 1996. I used to teach at the Campbell Center for Historic Preservation in Mount Carroll, Illinois, which is sadly no more. I taught 3- and 4-day workshops. Most of what I taught there was preventive. This is my museum environment class. I essentially taught them what I do at U of T minus the materials, as they got that in subsequent courses. I team taught metals course with my friend and colleague, Lindsay Selwyn. That course was preventive and interventive. And finally, I taught a course that on the books was called Storage Solutions for Small Museums. Nobody called it that. Everybody called it the box making class because we spent quite a bit of time learning how to make custom enclosures like boxes. I learned to make boxes at CCI as a mobile lab intern with David Hannington. He taught us to never measure, but to use the object as our guide, and using dividers like you see my student doing here to figure out how tall the walls should be. I passed this on to my students and they loved it. And many thanks, David. Every year I give a half-day seminar on numismatic preservation for the Royal Canadian Numismatic Association. One of the things I always demonstrate is the Beilstein test, and it is a huge crowd favorite. And half the time, halfway through my seminar, someone will ask me if I'm going to burn something soon. It's like, okay, it's coming, it's coming. Like most conservators, I do condition reporting. I rarely have the luxury of doing it in the comfort of a lab or studio. More often than not, I'm in the field. This is a rather extreme example. A few years ago in late January, I flew from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia to Machias Seal Island to carry out a condition report on part of an historic lighthouse. Here we are stopping to refuel on Grand Manan on our way back to Dartmouth. This is the lighthouse. It's one of the few lighthouses in Canada that is manned. Most are run remotely. This one is manned for reasons of sovereignty due to its proximity to the US. I was there to condition report the interior of the lantern, as it was completely unsafe to go out on the deck for structural reasons. And what you're looking at there is the lantern. I had 2 hours from touchdown to takeoff to do my condition report, so I had to be pretty organized. A set of plans and some chalk really helped me keep all the sides straight because they're all the same. That 2 hours, including getting the survival suit, that yellow suit you saw me wearing, off and then back on, which is quite a feat. And we were required to wear that suit as we were flying over open water. The suit is designed to help you survive if your chopper goes down in the water. This rowing scull belonged to this gentleman, Mr. Fultz. He had rowed for Germany at the Summer Olympics back in the 50s. At the time of the assessment, he'd owned this scull for 30 years. Originally, the scull had belonged to Australian Olympic rower Bobby Pearce. An Australian museum wanted to acquire it and contacted me to see if I could do a condition report for them, as it was too expensive for them to fly here to see it. The first email I received from them was quite cryptic. I honestly thought it was spam. But after a while, we worked out all the details. And this is the most in-depth condition report I've ever done. It was 30 pages long. I knew that I had to be the eyes, the museum's eyes, and they couldn't see it in person. So they had to make their decision based on my report. In the end, they did acquire it. This project isn't really a condition report, but an examination. I was asked by the Canada Aviation and Space Museum to go look at these ejection seats. These are a matched set, i.e. pilot and navigator, from an Avro Aero, which are incredibly rare, as I'm sure many of you know. They asked me to have a look at them and let them know if I thought there were any explosive squibs left on the seats. They were picking the seats up the following week and needed to think about safe transport from the donor's place to Ottawa. The seats were in a barn just outside of London, Ontario. Being in Toronto, I was a lot closer to them than Ottawa. So I went there on their behalf to have a look. I must admit, ejection seats are not really part of my wheelhouse, but I chatted with the museum extensively and read as much as I could before I went. Whoops. Anyway, I went, I couldn't really tell. Sorry about the slide there. But I took a ton of pictures and I sent them back to Ottawa. And this guy, Reg, who's a certified aircraft maintenance engineer and part of the museum's conservation team, took a look at them and figured, oh boy, yep, you got some active squibs. So a week later, we met up at the seats. I was there to assist him as needed and to document the process. He worked methodically, inspecting all areas with potential squibs. Periodically, he'd ask me to stand aside if a squib he was looking at blew my way. As it turned out, he found a few squibs. They were labeled and packed according to regulations for the trip back to Ottawa. I really enjoyed working with Reg, and I certainly now know a whole lot more about ejection seats than I did before. As I mentioned, I do treatments. Here we see the Harvard Collegiate War Memorial before, during, and after treatment. You'll notice in the before and during shots, he's missing his bayonet. This is pretty common. Brett had to make him a new one. We also do maintenance on outdoor bronzes. Essentially, it's a wash and a wax. As Emmy mentioned, I worked on this sculpture. I'm sure many of you know it. It's Richard Serra's Tilted Spheres, which sits in the International Lounge at Pearson's Terminal 1. Not long after it had been installed, it went from looking like this to this. The passengers were writing on the sculpture. The fact that this coincided with March break exacerbated the graffiti. On close examination, it became clear that the anti-corrosion coating applied to the sculpture when it was installed was failing. When scratched, the surface lifted, leaving the area lighter in color, in contrast to the dark steel. Light pressure from a fingernail or a key was all that was needed to scratch through the coating. The curator called Serra's people, and his response was, "I don't care what you do, get that stuff off the sculpture." So the curator, a former museum study student of mine, called me. Many things made this project challenging. The 12010 Corten steel sculpture was literally bolted to the building, so I couldn't take it anywhere. It had to be treated in situ. Here you get a sense of the scale of the project. It's absolutely massive. And it was surrounded by some very high-end retail, and meaning that any treatment that I devised had to keep that in mind. It's also in the middle of Canada's busiest airport, one that barely sleeps. It's also in a high security zone, so I was escorted at all times. Scalpels and other sharp objects are not normally allowed in this area. The whereabouts of my tools was a constant worry, given that there was little separating me from the passengers. Corten steel is usually rust-colored, but the decision was made by the artists and the architects that tilted spheres be coated with a rust converter to turn it black, and black was considered a better match for the decor. If at all possible, I wanted to be able to remove the anti-corrosion coating, which was Dinitrol, all 4 layers of it, and leave the black layer intact. After considerable testing, we determined that CO2, or dry ice blasting, was the best approach. And here's a during treatment photo, and you can see it did a fabulous job of taking off the coating, but leaving the converted layer in place. The curator wanted an anti-graffiti coating applied after the removal of the anti-corrosion coating. There were only a few sacrificial reversible coatings on the market at the time. I looked at what was used on public murals and settled on graffiti melt, a paraffin wax-based emulsion. For grins, we tested it versus the microcrystalline wax that I happened to have in my kit. Not too surprisingly, they looked the same. We chose graffiti melt as it could be applied by a skilled painter with an airless system, as we see here. This also helped keep the costs down. The sculpture was hoarded for the treatment, and all of the work was done at night when the airport was shut. And if you've never experienced it, CO2 blasting is really, really loud. So it's so loud that it would impede the operation of the airport. So here we see it after treatment. And absolutely everyone decided that it looked way better with that anti-corrosion coating off of it. Now, the Serra sculpture was by far the biggest piece I dealt with, but this sculpture by Ron Baird was the tallest. It's 33.5 meters tall, and it's made from weathering steel, in this case, Stelcolloy, which is Stelco's version of Corten. And it was kinetic, meaning the little bits that you see there moved in the wind. A few years before we dealt with the sculpture, a consultant was brought in to assess the piece's stability, as there was a lot of corrosion visible from the ground. As a result of their assessment, the decision was made to remove the components at risk and place them on the ground. And this drawing is just a close-up outlining where they were going to cut through the steel and remove the pieces to the ground. The brackets that attached those pieces to the 3 towers were also unbolted and taken down to the ground. When we, and our team consisted of a restoration architect, structural engineer, and me, because it was art, first saw the sculpture, this is what it looked like. It really was a Humpty Dumpty project. You can see that the steel in places was really toast, to use the technical term. This sculpture was in front of a public building, an Environment Canada office at the north end of Toronto. And if that wasn't good enough, it was right next door to a daycare. So we began this project late 2020, examining the bits on the ground and the towers. We took turns going up in a lift to get a close look at the 3 standing components. Here's Jerry, our structural engineer. And for a sense of perspective, this is an image he took while up there. And that's me on the ground with the red jacket. Jerry calculated the wind and ice load the repairs had to withstand. And here's Sheldon, the architect. And because it was the pandemic, we were all masked, even outdoors. All of the pieces had been tagged when they were removed so that we could put them all back together again. And this is one of the brackets that held the kinetic component to the column. The cut that you see there was made when the pieces were brought down to the ground. So during our assessment, we documented the damage and made measure drawings of the whole sculpture. Some of the steel was in good condition and could be retained. We kept as much as we could, cutting back the severely damaged steel to good steel. The drawings were marked up to outline where the cuts and repairs were made. The replacement pieces were made with weathering steel of comparable gauge to the original. And as we had all of the pieces from the sculpture and they were all labeled, we could use them as patterns to fabricate the new bits. Expo Steel Limited handled the fabrication. And you can see here, the dark gray bits are the new weathering steel, and then the sort of rusty dull bits are the original. So these had to be made absolutely according to the drawings, and then they're integrated with the original. The new bits were pre-weathered the way the artist did it, by wetting down the steel, allowing it to dry, wetting it down, allowing it to dry, and this went on until a nice corrosion layer was developed. Weathering steel is incredibly stable, but its one enemy is standing water. The corrosion that you saw was due to water pooling in those areas over time. Once all the bits were restored, the sculpture was reinstalled. Getting the pieces off the truck and up in the air onto the sculpture was quite a feat. As always, a lot of discussion happened before the pieces were rigged and lifted. A crane moved the pieces into place, and the guys made the final connection from the lift that you see here. It was incredibly difficult. This is like trying to thread a needle with a crane. It's really, really tough. So the crane got the pieces as close, and then the guys did the final connection using a chain fall. It was incredibly hot that day. It was about 40 degrees C in the shade. We had pretty tight tolerances on the steel, which made it even tougher with the heat. The guys had to use a come along to finally get the pieces together, and that's what they're doing there. They're basically just winching it in. Once there, they secured them with through bolts. And then later on, they went back up and welded around all the components to seal the seams to keep water out. Understandably, the kinetic components were tethered until the work was completed. And here it is finished. The guy in the red coat's my husband, and he's there for scale. So you can tell the replacement pieces as they look a lot brighter than the original steel. They will never match completely because the original steel's been there weathering since 1970s, but I think they read pretty well. Over the years, I've had a couple of Rip Van Winkle projects, and this one by far slept the longest. Then 23 years ago, now 25, I was hired by the City of Toronto to be the conservation liaison between the city and the foundry that was doing the work on these 4 sculptures. I was responsible for all project documentation. This monument came back into my life as a major infrastructure project in downtown Toronto, required it to be completely dismantled and moved offsite and be returned once the work was done. Luckily, I still had my photos and my report. The monument was designed by Walter S. Allward, the same person who did Vimy Ridge. I was responsible for 4 bronze figures: Canada Infantry and Cavalry that you see here at the ground level, and Victory on top of the obelisk. Before being moved, I had to do a condition assessment of the 4 figures. The lower figures were accessible, whereas Victory was not. We asked for a lift to see her, but that was declined. We used a drone to try and get a sense of her condition. We were particularly concerned about the stability of the wings. The seams where the wings were attached had opened with time, and this is not uncommon. If the wings were stable, removal was fairly straightforward. If they're not, it was going to be a lot harder to get her down. Once the scaffolding went up, we were able to determine that the wings were fine. And given the way she was rigged, you can see why stability of the wings was really important. So she was lowered to the ground where she was laid down for transport due to her height, and then the sculptures were moved offsite to a secure facility. The lower figures were placed on dollies with locking wheels, making it easy to move them around, and this is going to come in particularly handy when they're treated because the treatment is going to happen outside. Victory was too tall for this, so she is simply bolted to the floor. She barely squeezed in there. I'm very fond of Allward's work and have dealt with a number of his pieces over the years. Being with the figures like this made us feel like we were back in Allward's studio. It was an incredible feeling. The figures are larger than life, and for a sense of scale, here's Brett Davis carrying out a patina test. Brett treated these figures 25 years ago. They are now back in his job jar. Drummond Hill Cemetery in Niagara Falls. It's an important cultural resource, having both local and national significance. In addition to being an historic cemetery, it's the site of the Battle of Lundy's Lane, a pivotal battle in the War of 1812. In 1937, it was designated a National Historic Site of Canada. In 2000, the city commissioned a conservation master plan, and it was our job to identify the conservation issues facing the entire cemetery, recommend appropriate interventions and conservation treatments, prioritize the work that should be done to stabilize the monuments and cemetery markers, and provide costing for this work. I undertook this project with my friend Per. We looked at over 1,500 markers, and it was quite a challenging job. Elmbank Cemetery was an Irish Catholic cemetery on the grounds of Pearson International Airport. Decades ago, the cemetery had to move to make room for a de-icing facility. I was hired by the archaeologists who were relocating the cemetery to a nearby one. I was responsible for all of the markers. So, being a Catholic cemetery, we started with a mass. Descendants of the people in the cemetery were invited to attend mass in a tent next to the cemetery. I admit it was an incredibly surreal event. I mean, it looks like we're at a wedding. I'm convinced that if there is an Irish Fellini, we were in his movie. I was responsible for condition reporting and writing treatment proposals for all of the markers. I oversaw the repairs, which were done by the restoration masons. The markers were moved aside to allow the archaeologists to excavate the burials. And then the repairs were done on site in an area that was determined to have no remains. Once the markers were repaired, and it was all done on site, they were moved to a nearby Catholic cemetery, which is on the flight path, so everyone's going to feel right at home. Here's a fun fact. Did you guys know that when you put a crane up at an airport, you have to call air traffic control? I didn't. I do now. Makes sense. Honestly, none of us thought of that, and we did, rightfully so, get grief. This is the third case study from my chapter, the Oakville Basket Company flywheel. This steam flywheel ended up, through no fault of its own, in a parkette across from the GO station in Oakville. It was not designed to be outdoors. I was brought in to do an assessment and make recommendations for its preservation. The work was phased over several years in order to make the work more affordable for the city. In the first year, one of the things that we addressed was the fact that the wheel holds water. Weep holes were drilled to allow it to drain. Henderson Machinery Moving Inc. was brought in to do the drilling. When working with the skilled trades, I always ask for the fussiest guy, someone more fussy than me, and they always know who it is. And the weep holes were drilled using a portable magnetic drill press that you can see here. And you can see they did a great job. I mean, that's a lot of steel to drill through. And the holes looked like they were always there. In the final stage, the flywheel was painted. We paint to protect. There were traces of red paint on the wheel and green on the body. I had lots of help with this project, curatorial and otherwise. The flywheel was manufactured in Galt, Ontario by Goldie and McCulloch in late 19th century. Thankfully, there are quite a few comparable engines in museum collections. I looked to them for color matches. The red you see here came from Richard Fuller at Dune Heritage Crossroads, and the green from Clara Deck at the Henry Ford Museum. Parts of the flywheel had never been painted, and when it was in use in the factory, we knew they had to be painted for their protection. Since this was a curatorial decision, I consulted with a curator from the nearby Hamilton Museum of Steam and Technology. We decided that black would be an acceptable color. Every year, about this time, I visit the flywheel with my painter to determine what bits need to get painted that year. The flywheel is located next to a busy road and is bombarded in the winter months with road salt and grit. Not too surprisingly, this side needs to be repainted more often than the one facing the parkette. I've worked with the folks from Henderson Machinery now for a number of years. These guys are excellent riggers. Most of the guys are steel workers who learn to move large, heavy, delicate materials safely as part of their trade. This is the Gore Park Fountain in downtown Hamilton. It was going off site to McKay Lodge Conservation in Ohio for treatment. Henderson dismantled the fountain and reinstalled it once it was treated. Every aspect of the dismantling plan was discussed with the conservator, Tom Podner, who you see on the left, before the pieces were moved. Like all good riggers, they work slowly and methodically. I've also used Henderson to move art. In this case, what you see here is the outdoor pieces from the Rodman collection in St. Catharines. Brett and I had done annual maintenance for this collection for over a decade before it was transferred to the city of St. Catharines. Most pieces were rigged and lifted with a tow motor, securing them to skids for support, but some were small enough to be hand bombed. And here's my buddy George, and he truly is a friend to all animals. So once they were secured to the truck and the cover slid over them, off they went down the road into storage. This is the CN 6218 in Fort Erie, Ontario. It's another long-term project. This locomotive came into my professional life in 1999. Periodically, it would pop back into my life until 2017, when the city decided they were going to decide once and for all what they would do with the locomotive. My partner, there's the CN 6218. My partner for this project was the curator, Jane Davies, who you see here. Public consultation was an important part of this project. Community input was sought through holding meetings with identified stakeholder groups who had expressed interest in the future of the 6218 by soliciting public input from the town's website, social media platforms, through questionnaires that were distributed at the local museums, and by hosting a public open house at the town hall. All were asked to define what was their vision for the 6218. This project came about because some of the stakeholder groups had developed their own plans for the future of the 6218 and were heavily lobbying town council to support their involvement. Council's goal in commissioning this study was to have a transparent consultation process and objective analysis for all the options on which to base their decision. We were able to distill all of the submissions down to 10 distinct options. We took a risk management approach. As you can see, the visions are on the vertical axis and the risks along the horizontal. All risks were ranked as being high, medium, or low. We worked really, really hard to define what represented each level of risk. And you can see we use the stoplight colors to denote high, medium, and low risk. We put the H, M, and L in the middle of each box, just in case somebody copied the report in black and white, and or in case we had a colorblind counselor, as in town councilor, as my report was submitted, it was presented to council. Option 8, which was to repair and protect, was our recommended option, and it was accepted by them. And this is what she looks like in 2017. Like once the work was done. Like the Oakville flywheel, I had a lot of outside help over the years from fellow conservators, rail enthusiasts, rail historians, and curators. A lot of my work is consultative and preventive. I help plan for preservation. Finally, I love storage projects. This is by far the largest I've worked on. It's the Parks Canada Curatorial Centre in Gatineau. I worked with Moriyama Tashima architects and NFOE architects to design and implement this offsite curatorial center designed to house almost all of the Parks Canada collection from across Canada. The project began in 2018, and this was a really big project. The team began by touring the existing parks facilities. So we went to Ottawa, Cornwall, Winnipeg, and Quebec City to get a sense of their collection needs. I worked primarily with Moriyama Tashima's space planner to develop a storage plan, which you see here. And I'm sorry, it's probably too small, but basically we divided the collections the way Parks Canada dealt with them. On the left is the historical collection. On the right is the archaeological. It's essentially a dumbbell design. And in the middle is curatorial space. At the top of the drawing is back of house, and at the bottom is front of house. I did my first internship at Queen's up in Dawson City, working with Val Thorpe at Parks. This experience really helped me with this project as I came in with a basic understanding of how Parks worked. Parks wanted not only to be able to work in the collection storage, but also to be able to give tours. These locking cabinets we see here were designed so that the public during tours could look but not touch. Our shelving had to go up 20 feet in order for the collection to fit the footprint we were given, and most of it was mobile. Interestingly enough, when we did our visit to Montel's factory to see the mock-ups, you see in the background, almost every single person was blown away by how tall the shelves were, which I thought was rather odd given that we had put tiny little people for scale in all of the drawings. These images were taken during our final visit, which was in October of 2023. And you can see how large it is. And what we're looking from the archaeology side to the historical collection side of the building. The shelving was color-coded with archaeology being orange and historical green, with the exception of the shelving in the cold room, which is stainless steel. All is powder-coated steel. This project had lots of challenges. In addition to dealing with a fairly small footprint, we also had to deal with seismic issues and fire suppression. If you look at the seismic hazard map for Ontario, you will note that the area where the facility is has the same risk as much of the west coast of BC. So that had to be factored into our design. The little cuts you see in the four corners of this shelf are designed to take a D-ring, which can be used to strap the objects down. Fire suppression was also a huge issue. Because we were essentially building a warehouse, it was considered to be a fairly high risk. All of the shelves have perforations like you see here, so the water can get to the fire. It was a major pain, which affected our initial plan immensely. Originally, the building was meant to be completed and handed over to Parks Canada at the end of 2023. Our last site visit was close to that date. While we were there were crews, like you see here, doing the final cleaning of the shelves, which was not an easy task, and I really, really felt for them. But it's not uncommon for large projects like this to have delays. The handover is slated for this month. Fingers crossed. And any questions?